Now, Ottawa has offered $100 million to cut domestic steel shipping costs. Now, this is a new measure that has come into place with Ottawa essentially looking at the federal government is saying that they're allocating $100 million to reduce the cost of transporting Canadian steel between provinces. We know that steel and aluminum are on this 50% tariff list. And so this is a reason why Ottawa is looking at making sure that Canadian producers are selling to Canadian companies. Now, this program is intended to help domestic producers replace lost US sales by making Canadian steel more competitive in construction and manufacturing markets across the country. So now this $100 million measure is following Washington's steep tariffs on Canadian steel and is part of Ottawa's broader effort to redirect production towards domestic customers. So now here is a measure where the government is stating that their goal for this 100 million is to cut freight rates by approximately 50%. We know Canada is a big country. It's the second largest country land-wise after Russia. So it's very significant when you're trying to ship steel from one end of the country to another. So this is why the goal is to cut freight rates by approximately 50% with this $100 million allocation. And the program it will involve Canada's two major freight railways, which is the Canadian National as well as the Canadian Pacific Kansas City. Now, it is intended to connect steel producing regions with customers elsewhere in Canada. And this is essentially a measure to respond to the 50% US tariff affecting Canadian steel exports. And what that means is that means Canadian steel will become very expensive for US customers. So Ottawa wants Canadian infrastructure, housing, and manufacturing projects to purchase more domestically produced steel, which essentially makes sense, as now we have a Canada First approach when it comes to supporting Canada and purchasing Canadian goods made by Canadians and consumed by Canadians. Now, this detailed eligibility and application and reimbursement rules will determine how much individual producers ultimately will receive. But essentially, what's been outlined by Ottawa about how the program works is that Ottawa will provide funding intended to lower rail freight rates for qualifying shipments of Canadian steel between provinces. So now the government had previously announced that it would work with CN and CPKC to provide a 50% discount on eligible interprovincial shipments. And the newly reported $100 million commitment supplies funding for that policy specifically. Now, the assistance is meant to address a structural disadvantage facing Canadian producers, that being that transporting heavy steel over Canada's long distance make domestic material more expensive than imported alternatives. And even when steel itself is competitively priced, right? Because it's just very expensive when it comes to shipping costs across the country. So now Canada's steel industry has traditionally depended heavily on the American market just to be able to ship across the border. But with this US tariffs, they're making Canadian products considerably more expensive for American purchasers and essentially reducing orders. And that also means it would put pressure on production and employment when it comes to the Canadian steel producers. At the same time, you have foreign steel that can no longer enter United States, may be diverted into Canada, but that also means that it'll increase competition for domestic producers. Now, Ottawa is trying to address both pressures, one by making Canadian steel cheaper to ship domestically with this $100 million fund, and at the same time, limiting low-cost foreign steel imports and increasing tariffs on selected steel derivatives. And so now prioritizing Canadian material is federally funded project. So now providing financing and worker support programs is key element to making sure that Canada is producing and consuming Canadian goods. Now, this also encourages producers to find customers outside of the United States, meaningfully in other provinces in Canada. Now, Canada's steel industry, it contributes more than $4 billion annually to the economy. It directly employs more than 23,000 people, and it supports additional employment in mining, transportation, construction, and manufacturing. Now, the steel industry supplies the automotive, the defense sector, as well as energy, housing, and infrastructure sectors. So that's significant with Canada's strategy to build more when it comes to data centers, grids. Well, this is something that Canada could use. And it is a concentrated in communities including Hamilton, Sault Ste. Marie, as well as Regina and parts of Quebec. So when it comes to these steel plants, the capital intensive operations, they just cannot easily reduce production because, it's harder to sell into the United States. You can't just cut that production down based on what the sales forecast would be without incurring substantial costs. So now a sustained loss of customers can therefore result in layoffs and shutdowns or permanently restructure and reductions in capacity at these steel plants. So now Ottawa is saying that, okay, well, when it comes to the freight rebate of this $100 million fund, in one part is a broader federal response that includes, when you break it down, which is about a $5 billion strategic response fund, as well as a $1 billion business development bank of Canada's financing programs for metal manufacturing and exporters. And then it's also broken down to $150 million in regional development funding specifically for steel producers. Now, when it comes to workers retaining and expanding work sharing assistance, that's part of the program, as well as a Buy Canada policy for major federal contracts, right? Essentially, if the government is looking at putting out contracts and getting RFPs, well, it only makes sense to have Canadian companies bid for it, and have that competitive nature within Canada. So making sure that Canadian tax dollars that are funding government projects go to Canadian companies, and that means it supports Canadian workers. Now, this tariff rate quotas limiting steel imports from countries outside of CUSMA is going to help the efforts, or making sure that Canadian steel is produced and consumed in Canada. And this 50% surtax on steel imported above established quotas is a part of that. And then you also have a 25% tariff on selected imported steel derivative products, which will also hedge against having foreign steel come into Canada. Now, the stronger border enforcement against dumping and false origin declarations are also part of that, where Ottawa has said that major federal procurement contracts must prioritize Canadian material with Canadian steel and aluminum required when their value exceeds specific thresholds. Now, this is significant because the program could help steel mills compete for businesses outside of their home regions. It'll also reduce the cost of moving Ontario steel, for example, to Western or Atlantic Canada, and encourage builders and manufacturers to replace imported steel. Now, when it comes to protecting production and employment, well, this is very important when it comes to steel communities because 23,000 Canadians are employed in the steel industry. And strengthening domestic supply chains is a part of supporting Canada. And this also supports federally funded housing, which is part of the strategic initiatives by the Prime Minister, as well as transportation and defense projects. So now it sounds great, but there's still a lot of questions that still need to be answered, like questions like the program's effectiveness will depend on several practical details, right? So you have to beg to ask the question, which steel products and shipments qualify for this $100 million fund? And will discounts be provided automatically, or is it that you have to pay up front and then there is reimbursement afterwards? Or also, the other question is how quickly will businesses receive this money that is highly required to be able to have products made in Canada as well as consumed in Canada? And the other question that hasn't been answered yet with this announcement by the federal government is, will smaller companies receive equal access? And another question is, when it comes to freight, well, we know that that covers rail, but now are trucking and marine and northern shipments eligible for this fund? Is that something that's going to be covered, or will there be another fund when it comes to alternative mode of transportation when it comes to shipping steel across Canada? And also, will funding last long enough to change the purchasing contracts, right? So this also incentivizes Canadian consumers to to purchase from Canadian producers. But will this $100 million last long enough that it will change the agreements and negotiations when it comes to those purchasers? And the other big question, of course, is what happens when the $100 million allocation for this fund is exhausted? What will happen? Will there be more money, or will that have already changed things when it comes to producers as well as purchasers? Now, this is part of, this strategy of Northern Canada, which is especially important when it comes to many communities depend on seasonal marine and shipping or trucking rather than direct rail services. So now this rebate could help create a stronger east-west steel market, but the $100 million is a transitional support. It is not a permanent one, so Ottawa must ensure that this count reaches purchasers through genuinely lower prices rather than being absorbed by railway or what would be a small number of large producers. Now, this real measure of success will not be just how much money is distributed, but it's also going to be when it comes to how successful this is. It'll be based on whether Canadian Steel wins long-term supply contracts when it comes to plants, maintaining their employment and domestic projects, and continue buying Canadian material after this $100 million subsidy expires.